It might surprise you that we are going to look at in this class a basic history of ASL and why you need to know it. I'm a native English speaker and I don't really know the history of English, and that's okay with me. So why would we look at a history of ASL and why would we as signers need to know it? So history and culture may not immediately seem to have relevance in a language class, but the history of ASL and the deaf experience has enormous impact on the people and the language. So here I will present a basic history of ASL and you will consider why it's so important for every signer to know. So deaf people have a unique distinction. They are the most likely to experience what's called language deprivation. Language deprivation has been the common lot of the deaf for centuries, the ramifications of which are incalculable. Now, deaf people experiencing language deprivation today is on the decline, but it's still a huge problem. So what is language deprivation? Language deprivation is when a child does not receive access to language input in the first 5 years of life. From age 0 to age 5 is what's called the critical period for language acquisition. It's when the brain it's designed to learn language. And so when a child is deprived of language in that time period, it's called language deprivation. Helen Keller may have described it best. She said, blindness separates people from things. Deafness separates people from people. And what she meant by that is taking language into account. Deafness, unless everyone in your circle or in your town or in your country or state signs your language, you are separated from other people. I have known many deaf people who have not had conversations with their parents because of that language separation. So this of course doesn't have to be so. Deafness doesn't need to separate people from people, but it is sadly common. So let's start way back there. Anciently, Aristotle and other philosophers claimed that people learned by hearing the spoken word. As a result, many cultures believed that deaf people could not learn. They were not entitled to rights under the law and were often deemed socially inferior. In some cultures, deaf people were not allowed to marry or own property. During the Renaissance, these ideas were challenged. An Italian physician named Geronimo Cardano was one of the first known scholars to recognize that hearing is not essential to learning. In the 1500s, Cardano declared that deaf people could be educated, that, as he said, the mute can hear by reading and speak by writing. About the same time, Pedro Ponce de Leon, a Spanish Benedictine monk, was very successful in educating the deaf sons of noble families. He taught them to read, write, and speak so that they could inherit their family's property. Deaf education was not formally organized until the 1750s when Abbé, and I don't speak French either, Charles Michel de L'Épée, a French priest, began teaching two deaf twins by substituting sounds of the alphabet with hand signals. L'Épée established the first religious and social association for the deaf, located in Paris. In 1771, L'Épée established the first free public school for deaf children, and he funded the school himself with his meager earnings. In all, he established 21 schools for the deaf throughout France, and French Sign Language grew. Meanwhile, in America, in the late 1600s, a deaf man arrived from Kent, England, and settled on the island of Martha's Vineyard in what is now Massachusetts. Deafness is not always genetic, but for Jonathan Lambert, it was. Lambert lived in a small fishing village named Chilmark, which was secluded from the rest of the island and didn't even have a port from which outsiders could come and go. For generations, residents of Chilmark lived and died there, marrying other people from town. As a result, Lambert's hereditary deafness impacted the town to the degree that by the mid-1800s, 1 in every 25 residents of Chilmark was deaf. Historians assume that Jonathan Lambert used a regional sign language from his homeland in Kent, But this developed into what is known today as Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. And just about everyone in Chilmark used it to communicate, whether they were deaf or hearing. It wasn't a language of certain people, it was a language of the town. Outside of Chilmark on Martha's Vineyard, deaf people living in America in the 1600s and 1700s generally used their own signs called home signs to communicate with their families. Home signs were not complete languages with the richness of expression and design that true languages have. Users of home signs, both then and now, tend to develop language-like characteristics, but do not develop linguistic structures giving the cognitive benefits of language. Home signs created within families allowed basic communication, but did not allow deaf people to gain language benefits or general communication. In other words, they couldn't communicate outside their little group, their family, of people who had all made up those little home signs together. Imagine speaking a quasi-language only you and your family speak. How do you go to school? How do you learn something new? How do you make friends or date or socialize? How do you express yourself? American Sign Language, or ASL, did not begin to take shape until the early 1800s. In 1814, a minister named Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet met his neighbor, Dr. Mason Coswell, and his daughter Alice, who was deaf. This statue of Thomas Gallaudet and Alice Cogswell is actually on the campus of the Connecticut School for the Deaf, by the way. All right, back to the 1800s. Gallaudet recognized that Alice was highly intelligent, but didn't know any successful way of educating her or anyone who was deaf. And so through community support and financing, I'd like to say it was the first GoFundMe. And with the help of Dr. Cogswell, Thomas Gallaudet traveled to Europe to study the European methods of deaf language and education. Good idea, right? Well, Thomas Gallaudet went first to England to study a method being used there. It was an oral or a speech method at the Braidwood Academy. So they were teaching deaf students to speak. Those using the method were not willing to share the details of it, so it was not useful to Gallaudet. They actually required that he pay them for their information, which he was not able to do. While in England, Gallaudet met Laurent Clerc, a deaf Frenchman who was a highly accomplished teacher at the National Institute for the Deaf, well, it's called for deaf mutes, in Paris, which was l'Épée School, which used a sign language for educating the deaf. Gallaudet was impressed and was invited by the school's head, Abbé Rocher and Rose Sicard, to come to France to study the French signing methods. Gallaudet accepted and stayed in France for 2 months, attending classes, studying education methods, and taking private sign language lessons from Clerc. Eventually, Gallaudet convinced Clerc to come back to America with him to help establish deaf education in the United States. Clerc accepted, but said he would only stay 3 years. On the boat across the Atlantic Ocean, Clerc continued to teach Gallaudet French Sign Language, and Gallaudet taught Clerc English, or at least the beginnings of them. These two men founded the first successful deaf school in the United States in 1817 in Hartford, Connecticut, which is why that statue is there in Connecticut. Alice Cogswell was the first student to enroll. There were 7 students in all, ages 8 to 51. Thomas Gallaudet was the principal of the school, and Laurent Clerc was the teacher. And P.S. Clerc stayed in America. He married an American deaf woman and stayed here. Enrollment at the American School for the Deaf in Hartford increased quickly. Residents of Martha's Vineyard began to move to Connecticut to attend school there too. Students at the school brought their home signs and then later Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, both of which merged with the French Sign Language Clerc used to create what is now referred to as Old ASL. ASL has changed over time, as all languages do, but 60% of signs used in ASL today can be traced to French Sign Language. This is the French Sign Language alphabet, and any ASL signers will recognize a lot of similarities here. Many of the students at the first school, now called the American School for the Deaf, went on to become teachers and established their own schools for the deaf around the country. And by 1863, there were 22 schools for the deaf in the United States. Because of the efforts of Thomas Gallaudet and Laurent Clerc, as well as Dr. Mason Cogswell, American Sign Language was finally standardized. This meant that deaf people would be able to communicate with people outside their family and other deaf people. It allowed them to be educated and have a language. In the late 1880s, proponents of the oral or speech method convinced many US schools to replace ASL with speech training. Some students were even punished for signing, in some cases by having their hands tied behind their backs. Learning mouth shapes and sounds they could not hear took countless hours. Time they had previously spent learning math and science was now spent trying to vocally produce vowels and consonants. But ASL was still used by students outside school. It took about 100 years to rediscover through research that an accessible, complete language taught to children as early as possible provides deaf people with the best education and the best life possible. There is still a great debate about this, and linguicism, or the belief that one language is superior to another, is rampant. Usually it's believed that English is superior to ASL, or that a spoken language is superior to a signed one. Even today, many deaf children are from hearing families who do not learn a signed language, but instead rely on home sign gestures. This is one reason that members of the deaf community often ask hearing signers why they have learned ASL. That's because they often have little experience with hearing people they know learning to sign. All right, so now it's your turn. Now that you know the history of ASL, why do you think it's an important thing for you as an ASL signer to know?